He wore a badge. He thought it gave him the right to intimidate. He was wrong. This is the story of the night Officer Briggs met Lieutenant Commander Maya Johnson, and how his arrogance cost him everything. The road outside Atlanta was slick with recent rain, reflecting the scattered city lights in blurry streaks. Maya hummed softly to the jazz playing on her car stereo, the rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt. She was off duty, dressed casually, hoping to make it home after a long drive. Then the blue and red strobes filled her rearview mirror, insistent and demanding. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from a weary sense of inevitability. She signaled, pulled over, and placed her hands, visibly, on the wheel. She knew the drill. Officer Briggs finally emerged from his patrol car, his movements deliberate, each step conveying an air of practiced authority. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding Maya as it swept across her vehicle. She watched him in the side mirror, noting the way he carried himself, the almost arrogant tilt of his head. The name on his badge glinted under the streetlight. Briggs. "License and registration!" he barked, his voice devoid of any greeting or explanation. It was a tone Maya had encountered before, one that instantly set her on edge. She met his gaze steadily, suppressing a sigh, and reached into the glove compartment. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice calm and even. Briggs didn't immediately reply. He took the documents from her outstretched hand, holding them just out of reach as his eyes scanned her car. Maya's gaze followed his, a flicker of irritation rising within her. This wasn't just a routine stop, it felt like a deliberate exercise in power. "Taillights out," he finally stated, his voice flat. Maya frowned. "That can't be right. I just had them checked a few weeks ago." Briggs' eyes narrowed. "Are you arguing with me?" The air crackled with a sudden tension, a silent challenge hanging between them. Maya recognized this moment, the subtle shift where an assertion of authority was met with a challenge to that authority. She had witnessed it countless times in her career, intense briefings, in training exercises designed to prepare officers for civilian interactions. "No, officer," she replied, her voice measured. "I'm simply stating a fact. If there's an issue, I'm happy to get it resolved." Briggs' lips curled into a smirk. "Step out of the car." It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with an almost casual disdain. Maya hesitated, a knot forming in her stomach. She glanced at the road ahead. Empty. No witnesses. She took a slow breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. "Mind telling me why?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor of anger she felt. Briggs tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Because I said so." The blatant abuse of power hung in the air, thick and heavy. Maya's hands tightened on the steering wheel for a moment before she deliberately relaxed them. She unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open, her movements slow and deliberate. She stepped out onto the asphalt, her posture conveying a quiet confidence. She wouldn't provoke a confrontation, but she wouldn't back down either. Briggs took a step back, his eyes raking over her. She could feel him assessing her, calculating how far he could push. "Turn around. Hands on the car." This time Maya paused. "For what reason, officer?" Briggs' smirk vanished. A flicker of annoyance, perhaps even surprise, crossed his face. He clearly wasn't accustomed to being questioned. "Are you resisting?" Maya stood her ground. "No, I'm asking a valid question." Without warning, Briggs reached for his radio. "We've got a non-compliant driver here," he barked into the speaker. Then louder, more forcefully, "Turn around." Maya's pulse quickened, but her expression remained neutral. "Officer," she said, her voice low but firm, "I am fully aware of my rights and the limits of your authority." Briggs' jaw tightened. "You're under arrest," he snapped, reaching out to grab her wrist. Oh, years of military training kicked in. Her mind sharpened, focusing on the immediate situation. She cataloged her options with lightning speed. Comply and deal with the consequences later, or resist and risk escalating the situation. She knew the statistics. She knew how often these encounters ended tragically, especially for women of color. She refused to become another statistic. Maya moved with a speed that belied her calm demeanor, stepping back just enough to evade his grasp. "Under arrest for what?" Briggs' face flushed with anger. He pulled out his handcuffs with a flourish. "For obstructing an officer." Maya exhaled sharply. So that was his game. With deliberate, measured movements, she turned and placed her hands on the cool metal of the car roof. The metal was smooth beneath her palms. Briggs wasted no time, yanking her arms behind her back and ratcheting the handcuffs too tight. A sharp pain shot through her wrists. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured, but Briggs just chuckled, shoving her roughly toward the patrol car. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. The hard plastic of the patrol car seat pressed into Maya's back, an uncomfortable reminder of her powerlessness in this moment. The handcuffs bit into her wrists with a cruel precision, each throb of pain a fresh wave of outrage. She sat rigidly, forcing herself to control her breathing, to maintain the disciplined calm that years of training had etched into her being. Outside, Briggs moved with a swagger, the very picture of self-satisfied authority. He spoke into his radio, his voice low and laced with a hint of triumph, as if this were a game he'd won. The flashing lights painted the scene in disorienting pulses of red and blue, turning the wet asphalt into a swirling canvas of shadows and reflections. Oh, a wave of memory washed over her, a montage of faces and voices. Her grandmother, a woman who'd marched in Selma, her voice strong with righteous anger. Her father, a veteran who'd fought for a country that didn't always fight for him. Their strength, their resilience, was woven into her DNA. She would not break now. The driver's side door creaked open, and Briggs slid into the seat, a low whistle escaping his lips. "Well, well," he murmured, pulling his seatbelt across his chest with a sharp click. "Let's go for a little ride." Maya didn't respond. She refused to give him the satisfaction. He shoved the car into gear, tires squealing slightly as he pulled back onto the road. The patrol car lurched forward, the overhead lights slicing through the darkness. In the side mirror, Maya watched the reflection of those lights, staining the road behind them in an ominous, pulsating glow. "You know," Briggs said after a moment, breaking the silence with a tone that was almost conversational, "most people just shut their mouths when I tell them to step out of the car." Maya exhaled slowly, deliberately, through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Briggs chuckled, shaking his head as if she'd just told a particularly amusing joke. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She met his gaze in the rearview mirror, her eyes steady and unwavering. "I don't think. I know." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a quiet intensity. Maya saw a flicker of something in Briggs's eyes then, a brief flash of uncertainty that he quickly masked with a renewed smirk. Oh, Briggs scoffed, but Maya's words had hit a nerve. He'd always felt the need to prove himself, to assert his dominance. It was a hunger that drove him, a need to control every situation, every person. Her calm defiance chipped away at that control, and it infuriated him. His knuckles tightened around the steering wheel, the plastic creaking under the pressure. "You military?" he asked, his tone suddenly shifting, a hint of curiosity mixed with disdain. Maya remained silent. She gave him nothing. "Yeah, I figured," he continued, pressing on. "You've got that attitude, that above-the-law type." He smirked, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" Still, Maya offered no response. She was a closed book, and it clearly unsettled him. Briggs clicked his tongue in disapproval. "Shame," he mused, shaking his head. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Maya's jaw tightened. The sheer audacity of it. As if his actions, his abuse of power, were somehow her fault. The station loomed ahead, a squat, imposing structure of gray brick just off the main road. The parking lot was mostly empty, the silence broken only by the hum of the idling patrol car. It was late, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned to look at Maya through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured, his voice low and almost conspiratorial, "I do love it when they make it easy." Before Maya could formulate a response, he was out of the car, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed the closing of a trap. A second later, her door swung open, and he was there, his presence looming over her. "Let's go," he ordered, his hand reaching in to grip her arm. Maya twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out of the car, the sharp edge of the handcuffs cutting into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. The pain was a deliberate act of cruelty, and it fueled the fire of her resolve. She held her head high, her gaze unwavering as he led her inside. They passed a bored-looking desk sergeant, whose eyes barely flickered in their direction, and continued into the sterile, unwelcoming atmosphere of the booking area. The holding area was a symphony of neglect. The air hung heavy with the stale scent of old coffee, sweat, and a faint chemical disinfectant that did little to mask the grime ingrained in the walls. A worn metal bench ran along the far wall, its surface scarred with the etchings of countless forgotten souls. A heavy steel door, the gateway to the cells, stood like a sentinel at the end of the room. Briggs, his grip still tight on Maya's arm, steered her through the booking process with a dismissive efficiency. Fingerprints, mugshot. The dehumanizing routine unfolded with a chilling indifference. The officers behind the desk barely glanced up from their paperwork, their faces etched with a weariness that spoke of long nights and bureaucratic monotony. When the formalities were complete, Briggs's grip on her arm tightened once more, and he led her toward the cells. "You think you're so smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with a venom he'd barely concealed until now. Maya glanced at him, her expression cool and unwavering. "I don't have to think," she replied, her voice low and steady. "I know." The words struck a nerve. Briggs' grip on her arm became almost painful. "Enjoy your stay," he sneered, shoving her roughly toward the open cell. Maya stumbled, catching herself just before she fell. She turned to face him, her gaze unflinching, as the heavy metal bars slid shut between them. With a resounding clang, the sound echoed through the room, a stark reminder of her confinement. Briggs smirked from the other side, his fingers tapping a mocking rhythm on the cold metal. Then, with a finality that sent a shiver down Maya's spine, he turned and walked away. The lock clicked into place, the sound sharp and decisive. Maya stood for a moment, her breath coming in slow, measured intervals. Then, with a weary sigh, she sank onto the hard metal bench. The chill of the metal seeped through her jeans, a stark contrast to the simmering anger within her. One night? That's all it would take. The cell was a study in bleakness. 4 bare walls, painted a faded institutional green. A single flickering light bulb cast long dancing shadows that distorted the already grim reality. The air was thick with the lingering scent of despair, the collective exhalations of those who had been stripped of their freedom within these very walls. Maya shifted slightly on the bench, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension that had coiled within her. She had endured far worse conditions, faced down threats that made this cell seem like a mere inconvenience. But that didn't diminish the burning injustice of her situation. Through the bars, she could hear the muffled sounds of the station coming to life, the distant murmur of voices, the shuffle of papers, the clatter of a dropped pen. Life went on outside these walls, oblivious to the small battle being waged within them. Then, heavy footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, growing louder with each passing second. Briggs. She knew his stride, that arrogant cadence that spoke of a man convinced of his own invincibility. He appeared before the cell a moment later, arms crossed over his chest, that familiar smirk plastered across his face. "Comfy?" he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. Maya didn't dignify his question with a response. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and unwavering. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars as if drawn by an invisible force. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "if you'd just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." A slow smile touched the corners of Maya's lips, a smile that held a quiet confidence, a knowledge that he couldn't possibly comprehend. "Oh, officer," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Briggs's smirk faltered, the edges of his confidence beginning to fray. A flicker of unease, a shadow of doubt, crossed his face before he quickly masked it with a dismissive scoff. He glanced around the empty holding area, his eyes darting as if searching for an unseen audience to validate his authority. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady," he declared, his voice louder than necessary. He shrugged, a gesture that felt forced and unnatural. "Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude." Maya simply watched him, her expression unwavering, her stillness radiating a quiet strength that seemed to unnerve him. Briggs leaned in slightly, his voice dropping once more, the forced bravado replaced by a hint of something darker, more menacing. "See, here's the thing," he continued, his eyes narrowing. "People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get you out of trouble." He paused, as if expecting a reaction, a flicker of fear or submission. But Maya remained impassive, her silence a challenge he couldn't seem to overcome. She let him talk, let him reveal the insecurity that fueled his actions. It didn't matter, because he had no idea what was about to unfold. And then, as if summoned by an unseen hand, another officer approached from the hallway. He was younger, barely out of the academy, his uniform crisp and new. He held a clipboard in his hands, his expression a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "Sergeant?" The young officer's voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "We got a call." Briggs barely glanced at him, his attention still fixed on Maya. "And?" The officer hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I think you need to see this." Briggs frowned, his annoyance growing. He gave Maya one last, lingering look, a mixture of defiance and a flicker of something akin to fear in his eyes, before turning away. He stalked towards the young officer, his heavy footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Maya sat back on the bench, her senses on high alert. The conversation between Briggs and the young officer was hushed, their voices barely audible, but she managed to catch fragments. Something about a lawyer, a call from someone higher up, questions about the circumstances of her arrest. Briggs' voice rose, sharp and defensive, laced with a growing agitation. The young officer stammered a response, his words tumbling over each other. But whatever he said seemed to only fuel Briggs' anger. Then the heavy footsteps returned, this time with a purpose that sent a ripple of anticipation through Maya. Briggs stormed back into view, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of barely suppressed fury. "What the hell did you do?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her posture exuding an almost regal calm. "I didn't do anything," she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. She tilted her head slightly, a hint of a challenge in her eyes. "But people talk, officer, and some of us have friends in very high places."
The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Maya watched as the realization dawned on Briggs, the understanding of the shifting power dynamics slowly creeping into his consciousness. He wasn't in control anymore. The ground beneath his feet had begun to tremble. He spun on his heel, muttering a string of curses under his breath, and disappeared back down the hallway, leaving Maya alone in the silence of the cell. Maya exhaled slowly, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over her. It wouldn't be long now. And when the truth came to light, when the full extent of his arrogance and abuse was exposed, Briggs would face the consequences of his actions. The morning light, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long, geometric shadows across the polished marble floor. The air was crisp, almost brittle, with the hushed anticipation of a story about to unfold.
A palpable tension hung in the room, thick enough to taste. Maya stood near the defendant's table, her posture straight and composed. The orange jumpsuit and the indignity of handcuffs were gone, replaced by a tailored navy blue blazer and an air of quiet authority. She was no longer the suspect. She was a force to be reckoned with. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Reynolds, a woman whose sharp intellect was matched only by her steely demeanor, shuffled through a stack of legal documents. Carla barely acknowledged the growing crowd, her focus laser-sharp. She was a whirlwind of efficiency, her movements precise and economical. Small talk was a luxury she rarely indulged in. Maya appreciated that. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a dramatic flourish. Briggs entered, his shoulders squared, his chin held high in a defiant tilt. He still carried himself with that air of arrogant entitlement, but Maya detected a subtle shift in his demeanor. There was a stiffness in his stride, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes that betrayed his carefully constructed facade. He wasn't quite as sure of himself anymore. Maya's gaze met his, unwavering and direct. He quickly looked away, a flush rising on his neck. Good. The small victory was a cold comfort. The judge, Alan Caldwell, an older man with a weary wisdom etched into the lines around his eyes, entered the courtroom. He settled into his high-backed chair and surveyed the room with a practiced gaze. Judge Caldwell was known for his no-nonsense approach and his intolerance for injustice. He wasted no time. "All right," he announced, his voice resonating through the silent room. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor, a meticulous man with neatly combed hair and an air of quiet confidence, stepped forward. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and resonant, "the state believes that we have compelling evidence to suggest that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Maya Johnson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of whispered speculation. Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw muscles clenching and unclenching. The prosecutor continued, his voice gaining strength. "Furthermore, new information has come to light, indicating a disturbing pattern of misconduct on the part of the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." The murmurs intensified, a low hum of shock and outrage. Briggs's face darkened, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his gaze sharp and penetrating as it settled on Briggs. "Sergeant Briggs," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "care to explain these allegations?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat nervously, Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. His voice lacked its earlier conviction. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, his expression incredulous. Uncooperative? He turned to the judge, a hint of theatricality in his movements. Lieutenant Commander Johnson's record speaks for itself.
And he gestured towards a document on his table. A distinguished military career, a graduate of the Naval Academy with honors, multiple commendations for bravery and service, no criminal history, no outstanding citations of any kind. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in.
Are you seriously suggesting, Sergeant, that this woman posed such a threat that you had no choice but to arrest her over a broken taillight? Briggs opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The prosecutor allowed it to linger before continuing, flipping through his papers with a deliberate slowness. Additionally, he announced, his voice ringing through the courtroom, an internal review of your arrest history, Sergeant Briggs, reveals a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving drivers of color within your precinct. The murmurs in the room swelled, a chorus of disbelief and condemnation. Briggs's face flushed a deep crimson, his eyes wide with panic. Judge Caldwell set his file down with a heavy sigh, his gaze stern. Sergeant, he said, his voice firm, I am deeply troubled by what I am hearing. Briggs sat back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. She resisted arrest, he insisted, his voice weak. The prosecutor's lips curled into a sardonic smile. The body camera footage tells a different story, Sergeant. Another wave of shock and outrage washed over the courtroom. Briggs's composure crumbled, his eyes darting desperately around the room. Judge Caldwell's expression hardened. Bailiff, he ordered, his voice sharp and decisive. Play the footage. A large screen descended from the ceiling at the front of the courtroom. The room plunged into darkness, and the grainy images of the traffic stop flickered to life. Maya didn't turn to watch. She had lived it. She knew every frame, every word, every nuance of that humiliating encounter. Briggs's harsh commands, her own calm and measured responses, the unnecessary escalation, the smug satisfaction with which he tightened the handcuffs. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as the footage played out, a silence broken only by the crackling audio of the recording. Every eye was glued to the screen, witnessing the stark reality of the injustice. When the footage ended, the silence lingered for a long, heavy moment. Then, Judge Caldwell leaned forward, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, his gaze piercing. Sergeant Briggs, he said, his voice low and dangerous, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to provide a complete and accurate account of the incident in your initial statement. Briggs opened his mouth to protest, but Judge Caldwell cut him off with a sharp gesture. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Johnson are hereby dismissed. And his gavel came down with a resounding crack, the sound echoing through the room like a thunderclap. Furthermore, I strongly recommend a full internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct. The tension in the courtroom snapped like a taut string, releasing a wave of emotion that filled the room. Briggs looked as if he'd been physically struck. His face was pale, his hands trembling at his sides. Maya exhaled slowly, a sense of weary satisfaction washing over her. Justice, however imperfect, had been served. As she gathered her belongings, she allowed her gaze to linger on Briggs for a final moment. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, a silent understanding passed between them. This time, he was the one who would have to fight for his reputation. Briggs stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing with a thunderous fury down the polished hallways. His face was a mask of tightly controlled rage, his jaw clenched so hard that the muscles rippled beneath his skin. He could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, the curious stares of other officers, the hushed whispers of court staff, the intrusive lenses of reporters
who had descended upon the courthouse like vultures, drawn by the scent of scandal. He wasn't accustomed to this. He was a man who thrived on control, on the unquestioning obedience his badge usually commanded. He was used to walking into a room and feeling the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle current of respect, or perhaps fear, that preceded him. But now, the power he had so arrogantly wielded, the authority he had so casually abused, felt like sand slipping through his fingers, leaving him grasping at empty air. And then came the voice, sharp and laced with disappointment, that cut through the cacophony of his inner turmoil. "Sergeant Briggs."
He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. Chief Edward Harrison stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The older man was a legend within the department, a veteran of over 30 years on the force. He was a figure of respect, his integrity beyond reproach. His words carried the weight of justice. Briggs straightened his posture, forcing a semblance of composure. "Sir?" Chief Harrison studied him for a long, silent moment, his gaze unwavering and penetrating. Then, with a curt nod that offered no comfort, he motioned for Briggs to follow him into a nearby private office. The second the heavy door swung shut behind them, the chief's carefully controlled tone dropped, replaced by a low, dangerous growl. "What the hell were you thinking?" Briggs exhaled sharply, his defiance crumbling in the face of the chief's righteous anger.
"I was doing my job, sir." "Your job?" Chief Harrison scoffed, tossing a thick file onto the desk with a force that made Briggs flinch. The file landed with a heavy thud, the sound echoing the finality of its contents. "That's not what it looks like from here." He gestured towards the file, his eyes blazing with fury. "The body camera footage, the arrest history, the fact that you didn't even bother to ascertain the identity of the woman you arrested."
Briggs's nostrils flared, his chest heaving with a mixture of anger and fear. "What does any of that have to do with anything?" Chief Harrison leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk, his voice dangerously quiet, but laced with steel. "Everything, Briggs. Everything." He paused, letting his words sink in, emphasizing each syllable with a chilling precision. "This wasn't just some random woman you decided to harass. This was a high-ranking officer in the United States Navy." "You think this is just going to disappear? You think this department is going to stand by and let your actions tarnish its reputation?" Briggs looked away, his jaw working, his teeth grinding against each other. "She was disrespectful, sir. She questioned my authority. Chief Harrison cut him off, his voice sharp as a knife. "She exercised her right to ask a question, Briggs. That's not a crime. That's not insubordination. That's called knowing your rights." Briggs scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You don't understand, sir. People like that." The chief's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing to slits. "People like what, Briggs? Finish your sentence." Silence descended upon the office, heavy and suffocating. Briggs swallowed hard, but the words seemed to have deserted him. He stared at the floor, shame and fear warring within him. Chief Harrison sighed, rubbing a hand wearily across his forehead. "The district attorney is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years, Briggs. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and you can be damn sure this department isn't going to let you drag it down with you." Briggs felt his stomach lurch, a wave of nausea washing over him. "What does that mean, sir?" Chief Harrison straightened up, his voice firm and decisive. "It means you're being placed on immediate suspension, effective right now. Internal Affairs is launching a full investigation into your conduct." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And if they find what I think they're going to find—" He shook his head, a grim finality in the gesture. "Your career is over, Briggs." The words hit Briggs like a physical blow.
each syllable a hammer blow to his carefully constructed world. His face burned with humiliation and disbelief. "This is bull," he managed to choke out, his voice thick with emotion.
Chief Harrison raised a hand, his voice icy. "Don't finish that sentence, Briggs. Just don't. Pack up your desk. And if I were you, I'd get a lawyer." Briggs stood there, frozen in place, his fists clenched so tight that his knuckles turned white. His world was unraveling before his eyes, the consequences of his actions crashing down upon him with the force of a tidal wave. And for the first time in his career, the chilling realization washed over him. He wasn't untouchable.
Across town, in a quiet cafe, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun, Maya sat at a small table, stirring a cup of coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The news of the case had spread like wildfire, fueled by the viral intishar of the body camera footage. Headlines screamed of injustice and accountability. Lieutenant Commander unlawfully arrested. Officer under investigation for misconduct. Demand for justice ignites citywide debate. Maya wasn't surprised by the attention. From the moment she stepped out of her car that night, she had understood the potential ramifications, the symbolic weight of her experience. She had encountered men like Briggs before, men emboldened by their position, blinded by their arrogance, convinced that the rules didn't apply to them. But this time, things were different. This time, the truth had prevailed. Her phone buzzed with a message from Carla, her attorney. "Briggs suspended. Charges likely." Maya took a slow sip of her coffee, a faint smile playing on her lips. It was a victory, hard-won and significant. Yet she knew the fight was far from over. She glanced out the window, watching the city move on around her, a microcosm of the larger world with all its complexities and contradictions. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of rain-washed streets and blooming jasmine as Maya stepped out of the cafe. The weight of the past 24 hours should have settled heavily upon her shoulders, the exhaustion and the emotional toll threatening to drag her down. But it didn't. She walked with the same unwavering confidence that had defined her throughout the ordeal. Head high, steps steady, her spirit unbroken. Her phone buzzed again, the familiar ringtone signaling an incoming call from her commanding officer. She sighed, a mixture of anticipation and weariness washing over her. Then she answered. "Captain? Lieutenant Commander Johnson?" The captain's voice greeted her, warm with respect. "I trust you've seen the news." "I have, sir." A brief pause hung in the air, filled with unspoken understanding. Then, "And how are you holding up?" Maya glanced at her reflection in the window of a nearby storefront. She saw no trace of defeat, no hint of vulnerability, only the unwavering resolve of a woman who had faced down injustice and emerged stronger. "I feel like I did exactly what I was trained to do, sir," she replied, her voice firm and clear. The captain's voice softened, a note of pride entering his tone. "That's precisely what I expected you to say." Another pause. "The Department of Defense has taken a keen interest in your case, Lieutenant Commander. Don't be surprised if they request you to speak publicly about your experience." Maya exhaled slowly, a flicker of reluctance crossing her face. "To be honest, sir, I'm not particularly interested in becoming a media sensation." "You already are, Johnson," the captain countered gently. "And whether you embrace it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something much larger than yourself." She knew he was right. She had always known, deep down, that Briggs was not an anomaly, an isolated incident. He was a symptom of a systemic disease, a product of a culture that had allowed officers like him to operate with impunity for far too long. This wasn't just about her personal ordeal. It was about the countless others who had suffered similar injustices, those who lacked the rank, the resources, or the platform to fight back. Maya leaned against a streetlight, her gaze sweeping across the bustling cityscape. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened, sir," she said, her voice tinged with a weary sadness. "And sadly, it won't be the last." "No," the captain agreed, his voice somber. "But it is the first time Briggs is being held accountable for his actions. And that's in no small part due to your courage and your refusal to back down." Maya closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of his words settle upon her. She had not backed down.
Not when Briggs had pulled her over, his eyes filled with arrogant disdain. Not when he had attempted to intimidate her, to silence her with his badge. Not when the handcuffs had tightened around her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. Not even when she had spent the night in the sterile confines of that cell, acutely aware of the power imbalance stacked against her. She had stood her ground. And now she had prevailed. The captain cleared his throat, drawing Maya back to the present. "One last thing, Johnson," he added, a hint of amusement in his voice. "You might be receiving a call from the mayor's office later today." Maya's eyebrows arched in surprise. "Oh? It seems they wish to formally recognize you for your exemplary conduct and composure throughout this entire ordeal." She smirked, a touch of irony coloring her expression. "Now that's rich." The captain chuckled. "Will you accept their commendation?" Maya paused for a moment, considering the implications. Then she shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both humility and a quiet determination. "I'll think about it, sir." She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. Across the street, a young mother strolled hand in hand with her son, his laughter bright and carefree. He skipped along the sidewalk, oblivious to the complexities of the world around him, his joy a stark contrast to the weight of the issues Maya had confronted. She watched them for a moment, a surge of protectiveness rising within her. The next generation. She had fought for herself, yes, but she had also fought for him, and for all the children who deserved to grow up in a world where justice was blind, where power was tempered with accountability, and where skin color didn't determine destiny. Maya took a deep breath, the city air filling her lungs with a renewed sense of purpose. And then she turned and walked away, her steps firm and resolute, her path illuminated by the unwavering belief that change was possible. Because this fight wasn't hers alone. It never had been. And the story of Maya Johnson is a stark reminder. Unchecked power is a dangerous weapon. And the only way to dismantle systems of injustice is to demand accountability at every level. What happened to Maya echoes the experiences of countless individuals who are denied the privilege of rank, connections, or irrefutable evidence. Their voices are often silenced, their struggles dismissed, their pain ignored. That's why speaking up is not just an option. It's a moral imperative. We must challenge the status quo, demand transparency, and refuse to be complicit in systems that perpetuate inequality. Change is not a passive process. It requires active participation, unwavering commitment, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. If Maya's journey resonated with you, if it ignited a spark of anger or a flicker of hope, then let that be the catalyst for action. Share this story. Discuss it openly. Engage in meaningful conversations that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Real change isn't born from silence. It emerges from the collective voices of those who refuse to be silenced. It's fueled by the unwavering belief that a more just world is possible, a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or identity. And remember, the fight for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires perseverance, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to the long-term vision of a society where equality is not just an ideal, but a lived reality.